take it back, say, to the beginning of this campaign, as it was. You're talking nearly a decade of work's gone into this. And originally it wasn't necessarily, I knew that there was carp in there. I used to pike fish it a lot back in the day. My nan used to bring me down locally. And I did notice over the years a few people dotting in and out of the place, but no one really stayed. And it was sort of luck of the draw. Me and a lad who I knew from over my way moved in recently. He was into carp fishing, and we came over here just to have a look around. It's a big old place. It's a lifetime of fishing in one lake, really. You ain't gonna ever finish the place. You're not gonna conquer it in one go. It's very much, you have to sort of divide it up, have a look at it as in sort of I've divided it into, say, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, around about 6 different lakes. It's just 2 lakes, but the only way to get your head around it in a reasonable fashion would be to say that divide it up into 6 lakes, target specific areas at certain times of year. And so going back 10 years ago now, it would have been in the summer, we came round for a look around and we found a few carp spawning. The first time I ever knew that there was carp in here, I was pike fishing close by, and I came round with a lure rod, and I mean it was after the pike had spawned, so it was probably March time. And I was lure fishing away, and I saw a common, only a little fish really, but stick its head up right where I was pike fishing. I didn't know anything about the lake at the time, and I didn't fish it probably for about 2 to 3 years after that. It was comfortably 2 to 3 years after that. I didn't actually bother with the place, and it was only really luck of the draw that me and another lad had a bit of interest in the place. Like I say, it's a big waterway, a real big challenge for anyone. So at the time, having somebody who was like-minded, who fancied the challenge as well, was a bonus. So we both sort of set about and came down here. And I remember it quite well, actually. It was just after open season started. I'd say it was early July. We came down and we found the carp. The carp was spawning in one of the shallow runs of the lake. And there was probably between 30 and 50 carp that we'd spotted. And we thought we'd prime a spot nearby to that. And I mean, when I say prime, we both understood the getting fish to eat bait in a place this big that weren't exactly heavily fished was going to be hard work. So we was willing to put the graft in. We've come down with that day alone, I reckon it was probably between 60 and 70 kilos of bait, waders, weed rakes, everything. And we waded out down into the shallows until we felt the drop off in the silt. Cleared the area with the weed rakes, which was basically like laser cuts of 12mm sheet steel, a foot long, doubled over. They must have weighed around about 12 kilos of chuck. Really heavy duty rakes that was digging through the weed, digging through the silt down into the sediment below. Cleared the area, primed it with all the particles that we had prepared. We came to the conclusion pretty quick that actually buying particles at the time, before the likes of monster particles and carbon baits had ever come around, buying particles prepared through any kind of tackle shop was just going to be too expensive. Like you couldn't comprehend the amount of bait we was putting in at that time. So it was farm supply shops that we used, and basically we went and bought big Burco T-urns, and those Burcos throughout that season was running at least twice a day, doing 2 loads of bait, settling buckets, and we was rotating. But anyway, that spot that we first initially found the carp on, we'd primed that really heavy, really heavy. We knew that the fish were close by in the area, and as soon as spawning had stopped, we came down expecting the fish to be on the feed in that sort of area, but it was devoid of fish. The majority of the bait was still there. And it was a coin flip really. It was sort of, well, we're here for the night. We've managed to get the access that we needed, which at the time wasn't a problem. Over the years it has got a little bit harder to get in and out of this place. But I sat a little bit harder. It's got a lot harder to get in and out of this place over the years. But at that time, when we was both fishing it, it was a matter of just basically a little farmer's fence. Access was relatively easy. The only issue we had was the bird watchers. They didn't like us being there, but I think naturally carp anglers and bird watchers just don't get along, do we? We share the same waterway, but yeah. So we checked that spot. Nothing had occurred. No fish were there. There was no obvious signs of a good session ahead, and it was very much a guessing game of two areas of the lake, and we opted for the narrower spot rather than trying to target. I think it was around about 210 yards across, flowing water, very, very, very shallow area, or a narrow run of probably 60 to 70 yards. Again, shallow, flowing water, but a lot smaller of an area. It was almost like you'd say an ambush point for the fish, because if they was to move from any side of the lake, they have to pass this area. So we gathered that if they weren't over the bait, which we'd put behind the area where they were spawning, they'd have moved out into the open water, and some fish would have been passing through. So we took that gamble, and it took a long time to find any fishable water. You're talking, we was leading around for a good, I reckon we was leading around for a good hour and a half before we located an area that was between 5 and 6 foot deep and clean. And it was actually my mate that located that spot. I'd found an area at a lot longer range that was around the same depth and same layout, but with the nature of the time of the year, there was a lot of weed in the water flowing through the lines. Presenting a rig in that area was hard work. So he had 2 rods on that area that he'd found. I had 1, and then I put my other 2 rods at the long range spot, and we got our heads down for the night, cooked a bit of food, had a couple of beers, and that was really the first experience of this place. Well, the first proper experience, as it was, the first sort of dedicated approach. And at the time we didn't know it, but we'd actually stumbled onto a tactic that would pay out really, really well in our future campaigns. And the night went through with no fish. 2 of my rods got wiped out with weed. I'm talking, I think I ended up cutting the lines, taking the leaders off, everything. It was really, really hard work to fish that area. My mate's rods, again, his tips were all pulled down with the weed flowing into his lines. And it was early morning, no sleep. The alarms had been up and down all night with the weed. And I remember it vividly, just hearing the left-hand dowel just blipping. Not like it weren't a screaming take, it didn't seem like a big run. It was sort of intermittent beeps, just over a period of time. And eventually I sort of rose from my bed chair and looked, and my rod was actually pulling down and springing off the alarm and landing back on it. And that fish was motoring. That fish was really, really motoring. That was my first bite on this place. And this was back before I scaled down my kit. I was on 3.5 test curve rods, 18 pound main lines, 5 ounce leads, very, very big hinge stiff rigs this was. And this fish was just uncontrollable. And I assumed at the time I was into either a very big fish or this, I don't know, mate, like it weren't a carp. But as it would prevail, I played that fish relatively well. I've dropped the lead. It came clean of the weed, and my mate netted it, and he says, I was like, how big does that look, mate? And he's like, about 18. I reckon it's about 18, 19 pounds, that is. And I thought, mate, if an 18 or a 19 fights like that in there, I'm in trouble over the years. If there's anything big in there, it is going to be hard work. Well, that fish, once I cleared the weed off, it was just over 26. An immaculate black common, very boxy, big shoulders, and a paddle that was just, it was phenomenal, the paddle was. So I managed to recapture that fish a couple of times over the years. And yeah, it was a really, really dark common that was just over 26 at the time. And obviously that's my first capture. off this place, and I'm thinking to myself now, well, this place must be full of monsters. You know what I mean? That fish has stumbled over an area that I'd literally sprinkled probably 1.5 kilos of boilies over, and at the time it was Terry Earn's Dynamite Crave, and I'd gone with as much liquid additive that I can through any experience I've got fishing rivers and flowing water. I understand that having that sort of scent trail down in the waters is vital to bringing fish into an area. So it was Dynamite Crave and breadcrumb, cheap, cheerful breadcrumb with dynamite glug into it, again crave. And that was the spot then, that was it, we were set on that spot. We had this massive inland sea in front of us, and the fish had just come out the blue off an area that hadn't been primed, it hadn't seen any sort of pre-bait or anything along those lines. So naturally we assumed that was a holding area. Now, as that season developed, we learned very quick why the fish liked to be there. It was actually a back eddy in the flow that you couldn't make out by looking across the water. You couldn't see any flow to it in such, but it was almost a slack water where the flowing water had worn a deeper channel into this area, and it was always clean. There was never any sediment, there was never any weed in that area. I mean, at that time as well, this place flooded bad. I believe the Environment Agency put flood defences in up and down the river system that feeds this place now. And that has levelled the flooding out ever so slightly, but at the time I was fishing it, the flooding got really, really bad, to the point where we found out the one night we sat down, we'd fished late into the night, and it had rained heavy all day, and yeah, we woke up to like a screaming take. It was. We thought it was a screaming take, and actually all it was the fact that the water level was rising up that much that it had wiped out the rods, the reels. Like it was hammering through. There was that much rubbish coming through. Big weed beds hitting the rods, taking the lines out. You know what I mean? It was that could have turned into an expensive trip if we didn't get off that quick. But over the years that has settled down. But we settled on this spot anyway, and this spot was actually the furthest point to reach from any entrance on this place, which is a pain in the arse when you was using the quantities of bait we was. We was coming down on a regular basis between the two of us, divvying up this spot, chopping it, changing it. But between the two of us, we knew the mark, and we was filling it in with bait. And I really do mean filling it in. Like, over the years, the baiting quantities that I've put into this place have gone through the roof, because I know that the tactic works, I know the method works. You've got a large expanse of water which is packed to the brim with naturals, and I mean unbelievable amounts of bloodworm, water snails, beetles. Like, it's absolutely full of them, crustaceans. There's loads and loads of water shrimp in this place. So I knew I needed to introduce something in a large quantity to get them fish moving. Now, to my knowledge, I know a few people had fished it over the years, but boilie wise, I don't know how much had ever gone in. I did a bit of research and had a bit of a dig around to how the fish had got in here and where they was potentially coming from, and I came to an assumption that a lot of them was escapees from a fishery further upstream that got hit heavy, really heavy in 2007 with some floods, and that fishery fed those fish pellet, whether it's coping or aquastim, I'm not entirely sure, but it was basically high oil pellets. And after realising that, I did put them into my mix, but we'll get onto that a bit later onto the story. Like, if we're going back now, the first season I fished there, we rotated a spot between me and my mate, and it worked out really well for us both. We both had unbelievable seasons, but quantity wise anyway. As for the size of the fish, I think that season I had that 26, he had one just shy of 26, with different fish, both commons. There wasn't a lot of mirrors in the mix at the time. There really wasn't a lot of mirrors in the mix at the time. There was predominantly commons, a lot of 18, 19s, up to sort of 21, loads and loads of high doubles to low 20 commons, but nothing big. And we was really filling it in. Like I can't sort of comprehend how much bait we put in. I reckon every trip I'll come up, I put at least 15 kilos in, and that was every 2 days. And it was a mixture of small particles, maize, hemp, pigeon conditioner, a few maple peas in there to try to sort of bring the fish around to picking up something small and round like a boilie. I'd probably put a kilo of boilie in per trip at least, just to, because I didn't think that seen a lot of the bait, not a lot of boilie anyway. And there was no nuisance species. We really didn't struggle with nuisance species. There was no bream. We didn't struggle with bream. We did struggle with chub. There was a few chub in the mix, but that was it. It was predominantly carp, so I was confident putting a lot of bait in. I was only going to bring in the carp anyway. I'd never struggled with crayfish. I have seen them in there. I've seen shoals of silvers in there as well, big shoals of silvers that would quite comfortably wipe out a better particle. But again, no issues with those. So we was fishing hinges at the time, washed out pink pop-ups, and it was really working. It was bringing the bites in. 14 bites in a night was the biggest we'd done. And like, mate, we turned it to a runs water, and this, we're talking about a wild pit, and I mean it's really wild. Like, it's, the access is hard. Like, you ain't getting around this place very easily. There's one accessible bank, and even then on that accessible bank there's one peg at the top, one in the middle, and 3 further down. So you've got 5 pegs, and you're targeting an inland sea off 5 pegs on that accessible bank. So it's it ain't for the faint-hearted as it was. You're not comfortable over here. There was, at the time, we'd get away with bivvies, but these days you ain't getting away with a bivvy, no way. I'll sleep on a bed in a bush most of the time. We don't stay into the daylight, the lads that fish here. We basically show up in the dark and we disappear in the dark, and that's the way we've done it, and it's kept it rotating quite nicely. But yeah, that first season was really good. I think it was 111 fish tally, but nothing substantial. Loads of recaptures as well, plenty of recaptures in that mix, and it kind of faded off. The lad I fished it with, the lad who I was fishing with at the time, he moved away from the area, and I stayed on. I was happy to stay on. I wasn't doing nights at this time either that much. I was doing a few, I'd say probably one a month. I really weren't I was driven for it, but I didn't want to spend prolonged amount of times here. I was happy to come in, flit around, have a look around, find a fish for them, and if it materialised in a bite, so be it. If it didn't, it was just another session. And the seasons went on from there. I think it was my second season I bumped into another lad who was mooching around the place, and he was new to carp fishing. He hadn't done a lot at all at the time. He actually turned out to be a really good angler once he got his head into it all and understood the concept of these fish in this pit, that you don't catch them from anywhere. There's certain areas that they like to spend their time in. There's certain areas that I like to feed in, and sometimes you can see the fish showing. You can see them in an area, but they don't seem to want to feed. And I don't know if it's because the silt in this place seems, it's horrendous, really heavily oily. I mean, the mouths on these fish are black as anything, but some of the underlying silt and the sediment in there isn't very. It's got a lot of wasting off the river from over the years. It's been used basically to filter the rivers. There isn't many. From my research, there's only one more pit system like this in the Europe, and that's in Germany, on the River Rhine, which is another filtration system. But yeah, it's a dirty place. It's not for the faint-hearted. It really isn't. There's all sorts of stuff that washes up in here, mate. You're talking I've had sanitary towels, tampons in my lines. I found a big bag of dildos in there, which I'm sure will be in the video as well. There's all manner of shit washes up in this place. But yeah, this lad, he was he once he got his head into it, it was that same spot that was producing. We'd found another way of fishing it at this point, a way where we could really present baits into it without any sort of hindrance. The flowing water weren't hindering the way we was presenting. Like, didn't matter what pound line we used, we didn't have to scale down, we didn't have to use heavy leads at this point, because the first season fishing it, we ended up, 6-ounce leads were a standard for us, and it's not because that's what's required to hold the bottom. It was required simply because there was that much weed and rubbish coming through in the flowing water that you couldn't present a rig for more than 2 hours at peak times for boats. So we got a base camp set up at this point, and this base camp that we'd got set up was banging. It's actually where we're sitting right now, but I'm going back 7 years now, when we very, very first started this idea of sort of not your comfort fishing. This was as comfortable as it got. We didn't have the table over here, but we had a little setup over here. We had a bivvy over here that we all shared, a bed over here that we just rotated, and basically we had set days where we'd say, okay, if you're doing a night, I won't do this night, and we shared the spot again, and it produced plenty of fish, but nothing sort of astronomical, nothing really like mind-boggling. Again, mid-20s to upper 20s. But it was just the fact that these fish had probably never seen a hook. Most of them I know have never seen a hook. And you're talking wild fishing. But one thing we noticed over the years was it was a lot of common carp. Tons and tons of common carp. And it wasn't until we changed the bait we was using that the mirrors really started showing up, which I ain't got an explanation for that. Whether they got a more refined palate and prefer a sweeter bait, but we come away from the dense, coarse fish meals and started fishing the likes of like peanut-based baits and birdseed-based baits, and the mirrors really started showing up. And it was like, that was the only change we made. That was the only change we made. And the mirrors in here are stunning. I've had fullies, I've had horrible simmos, real horrible ones. I've had some nice two-tone levers, and it's the stamp of fish in here is completely and utterly like you haven't got one strain. They're either escapees, they're wild, they've come from all over the place, and you've got such a mixed bag of fish in here. You just don't know what you're getting. Them wild commons don't stop. The long torpedo-shaped commons do not stop. You know when you've hooked one. Just by the run, you can tell you've hooked one. But yeah, the first few seasons on here was relatively. I was the same. I was doing day sessions, flitting around. I was finding a fish by eye, and just playing it day by day. If I found a fish, that was great. If I hadn't, not a problem. And it wasn't. I'd say I was campaigning the place. I really was. I was putting a lot of time and a lot of my effort into it. But it probably wasn't until, I'd say, 5 or 6 years into the campaign. And like I say, at the time there weren't many nights involved. It wasn't all consuming like it is at the minute. And I'd got to a point where I was relatively certain there was nothing in here worth catching. I was pretty sure of it. I'd done a lot of time on here. I'd hooked and lost a decent common. I'd say a low 30, maybe a mid 30, right at the net. It was a powerhouse of a fish, and eventually it managed to get the better of me. But that's the nature of these fish. They are very, half of them have never seen a hook before, and they're not gonna give the game away easily like that. When they're hooked, they fight for their lives. I have never hooked carp like it. But if I was to sort of go through the seasons, it started getting a bit awkward to fish this place at about years 5 or 6 in. Over the years anyway, the pressure from the Environment Agency, Angling Trust and that, it did get a bit, like, it got a lot harder to fish on here. But, I mean, at that point I was committed, man. I was all in at this point. So, I carried on. I mean, they know who I am. They got my photo. They know me quite well, actually, funny enough. But, yeah, I did a fair bit of research on this place. I tried to make it as easy for me to do short sessions and successful sessions on a big pit, not a day ticket. I hate day ticket fishing. It's really not. It's not for me. I'm not a commercial man. I don't like the crowds. I like to be able to do my own thing without having to worry about other anglers pressuring the fish. It's much more me against the fish as it was. But I did a lot of digging anyway into how I could make this water work for me, even when I wasn't here. So I managed to find, obviously the place is river fed, and the nature of rivers being that they're gonna flood. When it really heavily rains, they're gonna flood. This place is terrible for it. You're talking, you might come down for a session. If you're in an area that's heavily inaccessible, you're either getting wet or you're stuck there until that water level drops. But I looked online and I found a handy app that tells me the water tracking for the rivers that feed this place. And it turns out, oh God, there is a tracking station probably about 1.5 kilometres upstream of here. So I could watch the water level from there, and then there's another tracking station downstream, so I could gauge sort of how long the flood had been on for and how quickly it was dropping between these two tracking stations to see if it was worth fishing here. Now, as primitive as it sounds, there was one lad who used to fish here a fair bit, and the method he used, he left a stick in the water with a mark on it, and he'd realised relatively quickly that once the water was over that mark, that notch in the stick, them fish weren't coming out. They weren't in that area. They didn't want to be there because the water hammering through from the flood was too much from them. They tucked away, they disappeared. However, I did all right with the water tracking. Anything over 0.52 metres, this place ain't worth fishing. Them fish do not want to feed. And it gets even worse in the winter when they've gritted them roads and you got a lot of salt run off into the rivers. If it rains and you get all the rock salt that's lining the roads, all the antifreeze and that running into the river, running into this place, those fish, they shut up shop. The water runs slate grey and they vanish. And I mean, they really vanish. I don't know where they go. And I've been on here nearly a decade and I still can't track them down entirely. I've got an area that produces quite well in the winter. But they don't seem to want to be there either. But yeah, we go back now to sort of 5 years into this campaign, I'd say. I knew the area that had been really successful earlier on in the year. We had multiple base camps over here, so we've got this base camp we're at now, which, I mean, apart from the fact I had all my kit robbed out of here, was a nice place to be. Spent a lot of time over here. We've had some good socials. We've had a real good campaign over here. And we had another base camp which was set up behind me to my right, at the back end of one of the bays, and the access to that was nigh on impossible, really. Sort of the way we was accessing it was dangerous. Yeah, to say the least, it was dangerous. If that place flooded, to get over to it, you was already at the brim of your waders when the water level was normal. So if you was over there and it flooded, you weren't getting home that night. Getting in and out of that place was hard work. And yeah, we did well out of there though. We really did well. And again, it was the same tactics that we used. And I'll go into the tactic a little bit of why it was successful. So, I mean, heavy baiting works well when there's nobody else to jump on it and you're allowed to do your own thing. Like those fish, especially the way I was doing it, I might have been fishing a couple of evenings a week, but I was baiting it 5 times a week, comfortably baiting it 5 times a week. So then fish were coming in and feeding. That was having a free meal 5 times a week before I fished it. So when they came in to feed and the rigs were in, they didn't even spook. I'd have multiple double takes, and you knew when I was on the spot as well. Like you didn't have to second guess your tactics. But in the particle mix we was using, there was a lot of pigeon conditioner. It was nice and cheap. Tons of maize and kibbled maize, flaked maize, loads and loads of cheap items. And obviously we're cooking it ourselves. We're prepping it ourselves. At the time I was buying a bag of maize for about 20 kilos of dry maize for about £8 something. That would virtually double in weight when cooked. So I was getting 40 odd kilo bait for £8. And it got to a point where it was that heavy to try to get it to this spot. Bear in mind how bad the access was and how much we was risking to get over here, that carrying buckets of prepared bait seemed just unfeasible. I could carry 30 kilos of bait in a couple of really big buckets. That was heavy, they weighed a lot. And what I actually did instead to counteract that, because it was a lot of graft, it really was, man, the amount of graft that's gone into this place, the amount of man hours and the amount of time and effort and energy, it's just, it boggles you. I can't explain it, I really can't. I can't put it into question or any kind of concept about how much work we've put into this place. And I say we because it's not just me. Over the years there's been other anglers that have put in that kind of level of graft as well, and some of them have reaped the rewards. Some of them have pulled 6 months blanks and just disappeared, had enough of the place. But basically, to counteract that graft, I built this wood burner. That was one trip over. There's an abundance of washed up like driftwood. Once it's washed up and it's on the bank, it dries out really quick. So getting this to run, especially through the summer months, was easy work. I built a couple of big stainless steel vats, welded the bottoms up so they didn't leak, and rather than bring prepared bait over, I'd bring dry bait over. I'd bring 2 sacks of maize over with me. It was virtually the same weight as 2 buckets. The only difference was 2 sacks of maize would give me 80 kilos of bait on the bank, where 2 buckets would give me 30. So I was carting bait over regular, soaking it in these vats of these stainless vats in lake water, and then coming over to bait up. I'd come over early, fire the wood burner up, get it really, really going, just piles and piles of dead wood through it, and I'd cook the bait on the bank fresh, and it was piping hot at the time, to the point we was jumping in an old rib boat that we'd left over here and stashed, rowing out to a marker, which was basically, it was a brick with a Lucozade bottle tied to it, so we knew exactly where to be. There was no feature to find. The places, the features in here are few and far between, and they're the places usually that produce the fish naturally. Like, the fish like to hang around certain areas without the need for bait. But this spot was tucked away. It was nice. It was real base camp carping. It was like the sort of thing that you could come over to, and it was set up for you. All you had to bring was your terminal and your rods. Like, we left old bivvies over here, we left beds over here. There was always plenty of shelf life baits in the bivvies. There was plenty of spare leads, everything you needed. I left a pack of pop-ups over here once, actually, funny enough, and turns out one of the lads I was fishing with realised pretty quick that they was doing bites. Like, he had a session and a half, and that was a washed out pink. We didn't know why it worked. We couldn't actually, there was no logical reason to why that washed out pink worked. The only reason I can actually think is these fish they harvest bloodworm beds. There's tons of bloodworm beds in here. You get eaten alive in the summer by gnats and mosquitoes. You can almost see you actually do see clouds of them over the water. And that's something I haven't experienced in any other fishery. Fishery, I say that. Any other pit that I fish, any other sort of wild water that I like to spend my time on. Having those is something that much of a natural food source in there is something that I'm yet to experience anywhere else. So I was competing against big beds of naturals all the time, and this is where I'm going with this, is that in that particle mix I was using, I was putting a lot of hemp in it, and I narrowed that down really quick. When hemp got expensive and I stopped putting it in, my results slowed down. And I'd rather spend my money to get the results than just leave it out. So I did a bit of chopping and changing over the years with the amount of hemp that I put in my mix, and I was finding that these fish would show up. Like, you had to get the spot going first. I wouldn't just show up to hemp. You couldn't come here and put a kilo of hemp out and have a field day. But over, let's say, a period of 6 to 7 months, if I was to prep a spot, and I will get onto one spot that did me really, really well. And if I was to prep a spot and I started putting hemp into my mix, then fish would show up and they would stay there. And I mean, they would stay for a very, very long time on a big bed of hemp. But I'd never get a bite. While those fish were preoccupied on hemp, I would never get a bite. I sat there the one day and watched over my marker as fish was crashing out. The marker itself was a bar that I'd hammered into the ground. And I'd sit there watching that marker, baiting it. I mean, I don't bait it no more. That spot, I believe, is blown. I think they've sussed that spot. But I'd bait that spot heavy, really, really heavy. And I was sitting there to the point the fish were coming out like seals, just bash, crashing out every 5 minutes over this hemp. And the marker itself was twanging. It was bouncing side to side as I was rubbing up it in the water. I went and grabbed 2 rods and chucked them out straight over the top of it. Didn't have a bite. I sat there for 4 hours watching those fish, and I did not have a bite. And they got preoccupied on that hemp, and the only reason I believe that they get that preoccupied on it is it matches the amount. It's very, very similar to the like the water snail content in this place. Small black and white snails with a little bit of crunch to them. That mimics that sort of texture to the feed. I don't think it's very much about flavour at all sometimes. I believe that trying to almost match the hatch is vital on a big pit. I mean, you're talking, if you're fishing big pits and they're unfished and they don't see angling pressure, those fish have been in there for years. They've got to that size eating something. They're not eating angler's bait to get that big. They're not eating tons of boilie to get that big, but they are eating something. And I changed my approach after that. After watching them feed on that hemp, I really changed my approach, and it paid dividends. I had the best seasons I've ever had after switching my approach. I mean, I was putting a lot of boiling, so much boiling into this place, and it worked. Oh, don't get me wrong, it worked. But I was catching loads of mid doubles. And I was catching the same mid-doubles from all over the lake. There's one fish in here with a very flat head. It's like a panhead common. And I've caught it twice now. And I've seen it swimming around over my spot, so I don't want to catch it again. But that fish loves a boiler. It's only a small fish. And I'm not after the smaller fish. I want the old residents, the fish that have been in here for decades as it was. And they've avoided the otters. They've avoided any kind of flood. They've stayed in this place. And they've got big through feeding on something else. So I changed my approach, and I realised really, really quickly I needed to find out what those fish were feeding on, what they enjoyed feeding on, just to bring them into the spot. Now, I've caught multiple fish in here where they've literally, in the net, just been shitting out snail shells, like loads of little small crunchy bits. And that's where that hemp really came into its own. I mean, hemp prices now, you're looking on nearly 40 quid for a 15 kilo sack. That's how expensive it's got to buy to prepare yourself. But I'd be willing to pay that because I know it brings in the results. And I mean, the trick I found I'll go now. It was a 6th year. I'm sure it was a 6th year where this place actually went from a campaign to an absolute obsession of mine. And I'd been priming a spot, and it was in the area that I knew the fish should be. You know, I've done my research, man. I've done bank hours and bank hours on this place, walking, even without my kit, just looking for these fish. And I knew that the fish liked this area. But it seemed I'd baited it, I'd fished it, I'd had some results. But again, nothing big, low 20s, pretty much low 20s. And the run I was fishing was really shallow, and it was hard to access. And at this point, I was getting a bit demotivated with the place. I mean, I put a lot of time, a lot of effort, and it was starting to drag. It was really starting to drag at this point. I was almost certain there was nothing worth catching in there, and I'll never forget it. I was wanting to finish out the season on here, and I thought to myself, you know what, I'm going to do this season, and then I'm going to move on. At this point, I was adamant that there weren't even a fish over the £30 mark. I hadn't seen, apart from that common I'd lost earlier on in the years, but you've got otters. You do have otter predation on here. It floods on a regular basis. You don't know what's in here. You could see a fish one year, it could be gone the next day. If you have a heavy flood and it's in the wrong area, it's just getting washed away. It'll end up in the river system, and I know some fish have ended up in the river system. A few lads have caught them downstream, and they've caught some good fish downstream actually, but you're talking river 30s that have just washed out over the years throughout all of the lakes through this area. But it was year 6 on this place, and I was heading down to bait up my spot. And as I was heading down to this area, I saw 2 fish milling around in the shallows, and it was a really, really snaggy area of the lake that these fish were in, and the flow pushed straight through this area, really snaggy. Flow was pushing straight through it, and thought I'll put a bit of bait down for them, and I'll give them 2 or 3 scoops of just basically sloppy particle mix. Pigeon conditioner, hemp, kibbled maize, flaked maize. There weren't big food items in there. There weren't nothing of any sort of sustenance for them. There was pellets in there. There was a lot of pellet in there. I end up going through sacks and sacks of pellet on here. I reckon throughout the summer I'll probably do anywhere between 150 to 200 kilos of pellets. And this spot that I'd fed the fish on, just chucked a couple of bits, like a couple of scoops of bait in there, thought nothing of it really, and just carried off on my way, dragging my big old buckets of bait down to the point where I bought a little granny trolley actually to get them around, because I was just too heavy, and it was like a lot of work going in, man. My shoulders could not hack it at that point. And so I baited my spot, sat there, watched the water for a bit, seeing what I'd say was a little bit of movement from fish over my spot, but I didn't fish it that night. I'd going back to the car, and I checked the area that I'd put those 3 scoops of bait in. Now, there was nothing left. There was no bait left on that spot at all. And 3 scoops of pigeon conditioner, hemp and kibbled maize and flaked maize leaves a lot of mess on the deck. And there was nothing. So I sat and watched that area then. And there was the 2 fish that I'd seen, and there was a handful more that was cutting in and over the area. And I used to keep a lot of bait in the van, shelf life boilies, bags of pellets, stuff like that, just in case I was having a real good session and I needed to fill it in. I'd always have shelf lives in the van at that point. So I went to the van and I filled it in. I'll give them some bait. I'll give them enough bait, I thought, to hold them there to revisit it the next day. I came down the next morning and watched the spot with even more bait to feed them if they was on to the bait. And I reckon there was 12 fish in that spot. And in amongst them was a good head of 20s. Out of them 12 fish, I'd say 7 of them fish were 20s. And it was a decent mix of fish as well. It was sort of 50-50 mirrors and commons, which is quite rare. So I was all of a sudden, that season when I was going to drop off, I'm thinking, I might have a decent success rate here. This is an area of the lake that I've never targeted before. It was an area that I'd overlooked massively overlooked, because there was no reason really for the fish to be there. There was no features. It was shallow. It was directly in the flowing water, and apart from that flow really creating a natural conveyor of food, they didn't have a reason to be there. But over the next 3 years, it was apparent why that was there. So this spot, It was easy to bait. It was nice and convenient to bait. If you've got waders and you're not... I did take a prodding stick with me, but you don't need one. You'll only ever come up to just over your belly button if you know where to walk. And it was nice to get to. And I could literally upend buckets of bait onto it accurately. No real hard graft. There was no spodding. There was no need for a bait boat or even my dinghy, my rib boat that I used through the winter. And yeah, this spot was... It became my go-to area. And it was unfishable with 9-footers. It was unfishable with 10-footers. Anything bigger than that, you weren't ever getting them in there. You had a lack of sort of power to the fish. There was too much giving them longer rods. I ended up fishing this spot with 6-footers. It was 40-pound braid I was using, down to a 60-pound leader, which was tied on to a sort of 4 rod lengths of probably 60 pounds heavy duty mono. And I mean, I was beefed up because this was a snaggy swim, and I mean it was hook and holds to your heart content. There was no other way of putting it. And to the point where I'd caught multiple fish, continental garden and muggers I was on at the time, size 2s, and using really big baits. I mean, market mad baits was an absolute darling. 22 millers I was using, I think it was. Fish meal again. Like, at the time it was a bait called Addiction, and we went with that. Like, the fish absolutely loved it. They loved that bait, man. And double 22s on a size 2 continental mugger. I wasn't even using standard hook link material. There was no sort of end trap at this point. There was no supernatural as it was. What I was using was a solar unleaded leaders in sort of 40 to 60 pounds. And I was tying my hook links with solar unleaded leader. And I knew that was never giving out. The hooks had bent out before that leader gave out. And this spot saw a lot of bait, and I really do mean a lot of bait, to the point where these fish were coming in, and I was just clearing out the low-lying snags to get into it. They was clearing out the silt on the top of it. They cleared out the gravel underneath the silt, down to the point where all they left was big boulders, and they'd even hoovered down the sides of these boulders and polished them off. Like, this spot was glowing. Any angler that had walked past this spot would have seen this from 40 yards out off the bank. Not a problem about it. It was that shallow and the water runs that clear at the right time of year when it's not flooded, that this was, like, it was just a beacon that these fish had come in and created this area. And it's not the first time these fish have done that. That spot behind me over there to my right on that Lucasade bottle, we was putting a ton of bait in there. So when we first started that spot, we went over in the boat and it looked like 3 foot deep. It didn't look like there was anything necessarily special over there. And we basically, we filled it with that much bait. We dropped this Lucasade bottle in on I think it was a 6 foot line, and it sunk. So we've rummaged around off the boat and found it, and we put it on an 8 foot line and dropped it in, and it just sat pretty at 8 foot. So we wound it up, put 10 foot on and dropped it and baited up. And again, this was that spot where we was cooking a bait off on the bank, and like, it was, I'd say within a period of about 3 to 4 months, that spot went from like a little hole in the weed to a tennis court sized area that was just sand. It was clean sand over there. Like, they'd cleaned the weed, they'd cleaned the silt out, they'd cleaned all the debris out, and all that was left was fine sediment on the deck. And when you went over that in the boat in the summer, it was, again, it just glowed from underneath the boat. It was mental how many fish were coming through there. That spot really did do a lot of bites. A lot of bites that spot had done. But this spot I'm going on to now on year 6 on here was like, I don't know, it was an in and out spot. Like, I didn't like spending a lot of time there. It was really, really obvious where I was. It was sort of easy accessible. If another angler was to have walked past it and really had their mindset about and fishing this place, I'd have found that spot off the bank. They wouldn't have needed to do anything else than just watch the water. And the area was shallow, mega shallow, really. Like, the damaging point of it was you'd put a rig out on it, and because them fish had cleaned the sediment out to the boulders, like, that was what you was fishing into, that if you didn't get the take, you didn't get your rig back. What you'd get back was a snapped lead clip, bent out hook or something. Like, obviously I was fishing heavy braid, heavy rubbing leaders because of how snaggy it was, and I was getting my kit back, but it was just, you was constantly changing your rig unless you'd got that bite. And I'll never forget it. At the time I was working shifts. I'd gone down in the morning, primed it. I'm pretty sure I had a bite that morning, actually. I had a fish out. But I'd gone to work anyway when I was on a weekend shift, and one of my mates had given me a phone call probably at about, I can't remember what time it was. It was quite late in the afternoon, so he said, I've got to come down and have a look at this. It was a bank holiday weekend, actually. It was August bank holiday, 2-3 years back. And so I've come down to him, like, I've met him down here, and I've had a look around, and I knew what was going on. I'd kept my spot quiet. I hadn't told anyone about it. I hadn't told anyone how many fish were coming through it. This lad knew where the spot was. And at the time, I reckon it was probably anywhere between sort of 14 and 18 fish circling this spot and coming through. And there was, in amongst them, I'd say, that probably the same common that I'd lost earlier on in the years. It was 30 pounder, but there was one in amongst all of them fish, one fish worth catching. I was looking at it and I was like, yeah, it's worth fishing for. So I got my kit ready and I stood around watching the water, waiting for my opportunity really to lower a rig into it. And that opportunity didn't come because at the time there was fish coming in, and I was rotating this spot. So all the smaller fish was basically funneling straight up the flow to this area, feeding, holding themselves up in the flow, kicking up all the sediment, kicking up all the particles, all the pellets and the small boilie I'd been laying down, and then turning in the flow and disappearing. And the bigger fish in amongst that shoaler fish, they didn't do that. The bigger fish in that shoaler fish was clearly taking the left-hand side in, out of the flowing water, swimming up beyond the spot, banking into the flow, coming over the spot, feeding for a short period of time. I don't know if they're struggling to hold their weight up in the flow, or they didn't want to expend the energy to stay there and feed because it was a lot of particle. They weren't really getting the nourishment out of that feed. I'm not sure. I'm not necessarily a scientist on it. I've just got my theories. And then coming off that flow back into the shallow area where the flow dissipated, and basically doing a big loop around and coming in. I never fed too hard. That was only picking up small food items here and there. And I watched that for a while, and I observed that, and that paid dividends probably about 3 months later. But while I was watching those fish coming in and out, like, that was hard to make out when I was really feeding because it clouded the water up a bit. But yeah, so I was back to that spot when it started to come to paying dividends. Like, after observing those fish coming in and having a little feed, disappearing to one side, coming down out of the flow, basically, man, that track took them 15 minutes. I don't know where they went. It was almost like they just banked out, rode the flow out of there, recouped their energy almost, and come back in, and they kept coming back in on that same track. All the time was taking this same track back in, the bigger fish was, while the smaller fish were quite happy to just bully their way up the flowing water and sort of basically just hold their own weight in there and feed. And the bigger fish seemed clued up to the fact they didn't want to be in that flow. So, I mean, after watching it, I watched a common coming in and feeding, like, and it was doing exactly the same thing. This common was a good size fish. Like it was hard to make out, but you know what? It was peak season. I say peak season. It was peak summer. This fish had spawned. Like, it was a decent fish. I know that it was a decent fish, man. I'd watched this fish coming in, and it was bigger than the rest. It weren't a giant in such. Like, I'll tell you how big it was. It was 27 pound 11 ounces because I caught it that day. And this fish was taking that left-hand tracking all the time. So I went, got my sawn-offs, heavy braid, big leads, big hooks, and I basically watched this fish come in, waited for it to feed and disappear, knowing I'd got a window I'd had a good window at that point for it to come back. And then I placed my rig straight down in that left-hand track, and I sat there and waited and waited and waited. I think it was about 2.5 hours we ended up waiting for this fish. And eventually it come up to that track, got a short blast off the dowk, a step way back off the bank. I think that's what I was spooking them. I think they could make my shadow out moving on the bank. And obviously this fish was taking a right close in track, and it just seemed that it was a bit more wary when I was there. Whether it could hear me moving around or I don't know what, but it knew I was there, I'm sure of it. So I stepped back off the bank anyway and watched, just sat back probably 10 yards behind my rods. I was sitting down way out of sight, and I got a short blast on the rod, and I've stood up and looked down to the area. And I've seen this common flank, like I've just watched it flank, man. I've seen the lead, still attached to the lead clip at this point, come flying out of its mouth. And you could see the little bright pink topper on the bait, firmly nailed in its scissors in its mouth. And I was like, yo, I'm in. I raced down to that rod, knowing full well that fish was going to make headway towards them snags. And it was hook and hold, man. That little 3-pound sawn-off was tipped to butt. And that braid was singing through them holes, man. It was howling, and it was locked up good. But eventually I turned it, played this fish, and he didn't like it, man. I did have to bully that fish. I don't like bullying them that much, but this fish gave me no choice. And it was a scrapper. It really was, mate. And yeah, so I netted this fish anyway. Looked down in the net, and I was like, you know what? Biggest fish to my knowledge at this point to come out of these lakes was 27 pound and 4 ounces. That was the biggest I knew of in the last 6 years at least when I got onto here. No one had anything bigger at that point. And I hadn't even had that fish. The one lads I fished with had a common with some white tips on its fins, and I've seen that fish knocking around again. And I reckon that fish is probably high 20 now. Maybe a low 30. We'll see, I'll catch it one day. But yeah, so I'm looking down at this fish, and I'm adamant that this fish is bigger than what he's had. So go to the van, check out. You know what? No, I didn't even have a van at the time, man. I went to my Fiesta, went to my little red Fez, and there was no scales in there at all. We've got a couple of unhooking mats, but no scales. So I've rang that lad up, and he's come down, man. He was a good kid, man. He lived locally at the time, and he's popped down to me, mate, and he's come down and he's weighed that fish. And as silly as it sounds, it's not a big fish by today's standards, man. It was 27 pounds 11 ounces. And it was 27 pound 11 ounces of absolute wild, like off the radar fish. You know what I mean? This is living basically in a river. And it's just, that's what drives me for it, man. I love catching these fish that are just off the radar, off the mark. No one really knows about them. It's hunting that unknown, you know what I mean? Like it's looking for the fish that no one wants to put the time and effort in to catch, because it's graft. It really is, man. But yeah, I've had this fish anyway. Done the grafts of it, sound, sent it on its way, and looked back, and I thought that like the fish I'd hooked, mate, had bent out a size 2 continental mugger, like it had opened the gape up on one of them. I was like, them hooks are pretty sturdy hooks, man. And I look back on my photo album, and it turns out that fish was actually the very first common I'd caught out of here. That one I caught on my first night at just over 26. So it had gained all of barely 2 pounds in the last 6 years. They ain't fast growers. They are genuinely like old English wildest. There are a few fast growers in here that have escaped from the fisheries, and they're the ones that love the pellet. Like, there's no denying that them fish absolutely love halibut pellet. They're clearly reared on them at some point in their life. It's like a lizard brain to them. They see that pellet and they just want to get their head on it. And to be honest, with a lack of natural nuisance species in here, like I've had one bream in my entire campaign on here. I've had a few chub, but even the chub are died. Like, I ain't seen that many. I don't know if the pike are clearing them out now. But yeah, I've had, that fish showed back up again, and I'm sure it'll show back up again after that as well, but we'll have to see. It depends. I keep trying to move because I find that the fish are residential to certain areas of this place. I don't know if that's something that happens everywhere, but this is a big old pit. Like, and I know I can catch certain fish in certain areas. I got it down to a T that bad. But that season I did really well off that mark. I did never catch that big fish that I seen. I've seen it come in and feed and it just disappeared, it vanished. And there's a lot of water to cover to find it, but I think I've got it down to a T now. I reckon within the next season I'll have that fish. But yeah, that mark produced well, but it only produced well in the daytime. Come dark, then fish disappeared. And I was getting probably a night a week in at this point. So I needed a mark that was going to produce in a night. So I looked at the water. I sat down one day, just staring blankly out over the lake, thinking of where would be the best intercept point, because the fish were clearly getting into this shallow run. Good Lord. And I was getting in there as early as 6 in the morning because I was fishing from before I went to graft. So I knew that I was coming in, and I knew that I'd have to be sitting close. That was following the scent of the pellet. I'm almost certain of it because I piled particle down there, and they never come up for it. They didn't just show up for the particle, so they must have been following that scent of that pellet. And I got to a point where actually, like, I was doing everything I could just to keep that pellet scent in there, to the point I was hanging at one point. I'd filled a Coke bottle up with pellet, punctured a load of holes in it and lowered it into the mark on a line that I could pull back, restock the Coke bottle and put it out. Almost like a Kamasan cage feeder. Them little black caps where you can fill them with a pellet and the pellet never gets out to the fish, but the scent does and drags them up into the area. Because obviously pellet is a lot more expensive than maize. So I've filled the spot in with maize and used that Coke bottle full of pellet as basically like an attraction bomb. And the fish would come up looking for that, find the maize and feed. And that worked well, man. It kept my bait bill down at the time. It was a bit of a nuisance because if anyone had clocked the bottle or the line that I was pulling that bottle in and out on, I'd have blown my spot. But those fish were coming in, and they was coming in from I'll call it the long range spot, because it was a pain in the arse to fish because you needed heavy leads. You couldn't get heavy leads out there because it was that far out. So I had a day where I sort of thought, I'll get the waders on. I'll see if I can access this area, where I want to be. There was a weird sort of almost like a slack water where the flow just didn't touch. Right on the edge of that slack water. The only thing that gave that away was there's a lot of bird life on it. I'm talking, you get woke up by 300 coots in the morning, man. It's insane. Hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of seagulls on it. Probably 50 to 60 swans at any one point. The whole place is real shallow, so you really don't get away with putting a load of bait in if the fish aren't finding it, because all you'll get harassed by is bird life. And I've caught multiple ducks over the years. Tons and tons of tufties and coots over the years, actually. But I found this spot. And I watched the water, and I noticed all the bird feathers and the scum on the water wasn't moving. It was static, it was dead. And then there was a clean line next to this spot where anything that kind of blew into it would move off and disappear, like it would just vanish down the lake. And that was when I clocked that. That must be the edge of the flow. That must be where the flow is intercepting across this slack water. So I've got the waders out, I had a mooch around, and when I got there, I found it was deep enough. It's touch and go on the waders. I've got wet a few times because you get random snags wash up on the route to get to it, and when they wash up and you don't know they're there, yeah, you're in shit's creek, man. You're just straight over them, bosh, in your waders, up to your neck, lovely. But yeah, I found this spot and put this marker out onto it, and started filling that marker. Now, there's been a couple of lads over the years help me with this. Like, odds and sods, like, I'm just cheekily ask, I'll tell you what, yeah, I'm going that way with you. Don't suppose you want to help me bait up? And at one point, I had a little Fiat van, and I filled that thing up. There must have been, I reckon the first hit of bait I did on that was 120 kilos to get it going. And that Fiat van was stacked to the brim. And I mean, like, it was bucket after bucket after bucket after bucket of particles. And that was 120 key hit to get the spot going. And then it was 15 key every single day, 5 days a week while I was at work, passing through to keep that spot going. Now, that's an extortion amount of bait if you're going to buy that in prepared. So my Burko was just burning black at home. It was constantly on the go. I'd have buckets and buckets of bait soaking, constantly cooking. Like, weren't freezing nothing. It was all fresh. And then I realised, actually, you know what? It was easier for me to cook loads of bait off and leave it. And I worked out pretty quick. These fish like mouldy bait, you know. Like, the mouldier the bait, the more fermented it was. The fish got onto it really quick, and they loved it. I don't know if it was because it was breaking down and the aminos in it was giving off. I don't know. But they really did like that mouldy bait. And, I mean, the only people that didn't like mouldy bait were the lads at work who had to drive my van after that mouldy bait had been in there. But we went with this spot, and like I say, I was ploughing it with bait, man. That became a daily routine. It weren't like it was, some lads go fishing on a Friday, set up a bivvy and sit there till a Sunday afternoon and go home to their bird or whatever at home. Like, this was a daily thing for me. I'd finish work, drive down there, waders on, buckets of bait, 2 buckets of bait, baiting spoon, wade out to the mark, clip 1 bucket to my marker while I filled it in. Then switch the bucket, fill it in with the next bucket and go. And I would do that every single day, apart from the day I was going to fish. The day I was going to fish it, look, I won't say what day that is that I fish on here, but the day I was going to fish it, I wouldn't bother filling it in before work, after work even, should I say. I'd just show up in the dark, put the rods out, 4 rods onto the mark. At the time, when I first started fishing it, it was mega long ronnies, mega long ronnies. Really, really, really stiff boom sections with the crimps. And I'd go out 4 rods, I'd put 10 key of bait straight over the top of them, and in that mixer would be probably 5 key of, I'd say, maize, a key of boilie, 2 key of hemp, and 2 kilo of pellet. And I got that spot banging to the point where 10 o'clock was bite time. Like, there was no variation to it. Bite time was 10 o'clock. And one of the lads who was fishing here at the time, I was having a chat with him, and I said to him, I was like, yeah, I'll have one by 10. 10 o'clock, I'll have a bite. And like, when you look at the place and you think to yourself how much graft has to go into it and how hard the place is, you shouldn't really have a registered bite time, man. But I was making this as if it was a fishery. I was putting the bait in at the same time. So I'd show up to put the bait in, and I'd get from work to here at exactly the same time. It was the same roads I'd take. The traffic was always very similar. The bait went in at the same time, and it was like a dinner bell. And I reckon I'd put that bait in throughout the week at the same time. And when I showed up to fish, them fish weren't coming in till 8 o'clock on the night. I know they weren't coming in till 8 o'clock on the night. Maybe a little bit after 8 o'clock. I wouldn't get a bite till 10, because them fish would clear out the hemp. They'd get preoccupied on that hemp. Then they'd clear out the pellet, and then they'd move over to the maize and the boiler. Like, I don't think maize is very much up in their pecking order, but they'd move over to the maize and boiler. And that was what was producing that bite at 10 o'clock. Every single night without fail. And that tactic worked well for me, man. That day that I said to that lad, I guarantee you I'll get a bite at 10 o'clock. The rod has gone at 3 minutes past 10. He was standing in my swim. 3 minutes past 10, that rod has gone. Hit into that fish. And it was... Didn't fight very well, actually, considering. And that fish was just over 26 again, a nice common. But yeah, that spot was rocking. Really, really was rocking, that spot was. But that spot would rock until October. It would be wicked through September. August, September time, that spot was in its peak. You know, that was the time I really focused that campaign, man. And I kept the bait going in, mouldy bait, loads of mouldy bait for them. Loads of rock salt. I was buying 25 kilo sacks of rock salt, big, massive oarslick size things. And I was just coming down and just handballing them in. And the fish loved it to an extent, and then that kind of phased off it. But I knew when I was phasing off it, the boats would slow down. As soon as I stopped putting that rock salt in, I think it was either there was a build up in the sediment of it, and it was kind of either altering the pH in that area or what, I don't know, or whether they just didn't like the amount that was going in. But I could work it out. It didn't take a lot to realise that I'd overdone it or underdone it. Like, I've had results on here on the rock salt really well, actually, to a point where I was fishing it, man, and as a sort of an experiment, I thought, you know what, I'll send out 2 hoppers of bait on my bait boat. 1 hopper went out with a rig, pellets, hemp. The other went out with a rig and rock salt, nothing else. And at that time, this was just after spawning, so they was craving that nutrient. I'm almost certain that is the reason it was happening. And it was probably 2 weeks after spawning, and them rock salt hoppers did not stop going. Like, they would, I don't know, they just ignored the pellet for that rock salt. And that worked really well. And like I say, it was getting harder to fish, so was a problem. And these spots that I was doing really well on were in areas that was very easy to spot me. Any other angler could get into them. And like, I like to reap what I sow. I don't like... I won't jump on someone's spot. You know what, if you've got some work going on and you're putting the graft in, man, fair play to you. I understand how hard that is to do. So I wanted to move it, man, because I understand that not everyone's like that. Like, there's a lot of lads out there that will happily jump on your hard work. So these easily accessible spots, these easy to see me in spots as it was in my best interest at the time, you know, to sort of stay under the radar of it. And I'd stayed under the radar really well for years on it. There was a few lads that knew what I was on, but not many. And so this is why half of this campaign is dark. Mate, I'm like a nocturnal animal on here. Like, I show up with my bed chair and that is it. You won't see me in a bivvy, don't matter what the weather is, man. I buy the kit to keep myself warm throughout the winter. If it rains, mate, I'll just sleep under a tarp. Oh, there's no comfort to this. There is no comfort to this fishing at all, mate. I'll cook on fires, mate. I don't want to carry a gas canister with me. I need a gas canister, a cooker, a kettle. No, man, I'm just a little fire pit. I mean, this here is base camp anyway, but there's fire pits dotted around this lake where I've been fishing. If you can find them, then you found one of my swims. But yeah, basically, like, most of the fishing ended up in the dark, and I made sure that the spots then that I was fishing was not accessible. You know what I mean? That long range spot, you ain't reaching it. Can't send a bait boat out there. The flow will disappear your bait boat pretty damn quick unless you got something with a nice big motor on the back of it. You can't cast to it. Like, you ain't getting the lead heavy enough out there. You ain't presenting the rig properly out to it. Like, the only way to it is to wade to it, and I was wading to it, underarming the rods with the rigs on, and I'm talking like 5-6 ounce leads, always a size 2 or above. Mate, 50 pound mainline braid, because there's that many snags out there that if a fish does make its way into a snag, it's either coming out, or if it does dump the rig, I'm getting the majority of it back, man. I'm straightening out hooks just to make sure that I can get my kit back. And yeah, so I switched then, and I thought, you know what, I've been relatively under the radar as it is. I've been really well hidden. I need to increase that now. I need to make sure that I am like, I'll just disappear, basically. Once I'm here, you are not finding me. And there was incidents where I had dog units looking for us. We had dog units looking for us, and they couldn't find us on here. There was a lot of graft that went into making sure that we couldn't be found. Like, I mean, I don't understand the issue. Like, just leave us alone, man. We're all right over here. But it was all about the fishing. It was all about that adventure for me. Over the years, like, I made my spots really hard to find. Like, people knew where I was, but you're looking at such an expanse of water. I stopped using the markers that I was using. Like, them markers really give the game away, man. And if anyone knew what they was looking for, they'd know where roughly to fish. Presenting the bait was probably not impossible on them, but it was still the fact that you was close to my work, and being close to it in this kind of sort of game's enough, ain't it, really? But, mate, this campaign just took over. There was no other fishery I wanted to fish. There was no other waterway I wanted to fish, man. I was constantly on this. This was it, man, for me. This was the campaign that I wanted to sort of wrap up and finish. And I'm talking, like, to the point where I had maps of this place, laminated, markers, distances to certain features that I'd found. Like, I'd go in my waders and remove all the snags in the swims after the floods. And like, I've took out safes out of here. I've dragged the front end of a car out of here. Like, there's all manner of shit that really washes up in this place, and there's, like, it's insane. Honestly, you just can't get a concept for it. It's not like, you ain't fishing a fishery, man. The fish you're fishing for are as wild as they come, mate. They really are. But I got my spots going well. My first big fish, the first big fish that I'll catch in the UK, my first 30 at least, which, like I say, by today's standards ain't a big fish, but my first 30 ain't coming from linear. My first 30 is not coming from a ticket water. My first 30 is coming from a wild water, definitely. It's going to come from a park, like a shitty council estate park or something, or it's going to come from here. Or, I tell you what, you know what, there's a few in the canal that I target that I've seen, but we'll get onto that in another series anyway. But you're talking, like, now, like, with the otter on here, like, I've caught fish that have been heavily otter damaged. I reckon that out of them, between them 30 and 50 fish I spotted at the very beginning of my campaign, I reckon there's closer to 30 now than there is 50. I've caught fish with otter damage, and now I've caught fish with otter damage probably 7 years ago, 8 years ago. And at the time, didn't actually know what it was. Like, I'm looking at this fish thinking it's either been ragged over the shallows in a flood or something. And I was younger at the time, and obviously otters didn't seem to be a big problem at this point. And now looking back at the photos, like, it's clear this fish had no peck. Like, that peck had been eaten. It hadn't rubbed up something funny in a flood. That peck had been eaten. Its face was damaged, man. You could see, like, looking back at clearer photos of it. So I caught this fish. Like, the fish in question I caught off the very first spot on the lake that we ever made. And I caught it. I'll never forget, it was on a supermoon. It was a real big moon. And the rods bounced and come back slack line. And that's really unstereotypical of the boats in this place. Usually you're lucky to get your reel in one piece when you pick up a fish out of there. And the fish fought really weird. Like, it bolted one side, kind of slackened off, come back, and then bolted back to that side, slackened off. It never put up much of a fight. And netted the fish, looked down, and I thought, yo, it's a nice looking fish. It's a big frame fish in the net. And got it up, hoisted it up onto the mat, unhooked it, rolled it over. So one side of it was like a fully scaled at the front. It was weird. It was like half fully scaled, and it kind of tapered off, and it was just a little tiny, like a shitty linear. It weren't like a big apple slice thing. It was little tiny linear scales down it. And then the other side of it was a full linear. And I'm like, oh, never characteristic fish it really was, but it had a peck missing, half its face chewed off, and a stubby tail. Actually, we called the fish Stumpy in the end. Now, I'm not one for naming fish, and I'm not one for chasing named fish at all. But this fish it just had a stump. Like, that was the only way to put it. It had a little stumpy peck, a little stumpy tail. It was short and fat. And I caught that fish on the supermoon, and I pulled out of probably a low to mid 20 common as well over the baited spot. And I was rotating this spot at the time as well with another lad. And 6 days later, never forget it, 6 days later, he caught the same fish off the same spot. It was almost like that fish had got caught, went straight back on and fed, kept eating and just kept eating and just kept eating and got caught again. Like, I'm assuming it's a dumb fish because, funny enough, he got caught 4 months after that by another lad who was on here at the time. And it never really fluctuated any more than sort of... I had it, I think it was just under 24.5, 24 pounds 7 ounces or 24 pound 8 ounces. And 6 days later, he got caught at, I think it was like 24 pounds 9 ounces or 8 ounces or something. He didn't, you know what I mean? He hadn't been on a heavy feed. And then 4 months after that, I believe it was caught at 24 pounds 10. So it weren't a fast growing fish, this thing weren't. But real characteristic, otter damaged. Like 8 years ago, I'm going to say. 7 or 8 years, I think it is. Like, I think it's hard to remember, man. The years are all blending into one on this place. I haven't moved off here. It's like a little time capsule. But, it's that fish with the otter damage. This was before the carp scene was kicking up fuss about otters. You know what I mean? This was like at a time where all your social medias, no one was mentioning otters. There weren't the problems with otters that we have now. Like they weren't as prominent at the time. But there was otters here, and this is next to a busy day ticket complex, and them otters have been around for a while. I'm understanding now that complex has had a couple of problems with otters as well, and there's a few other places down the valley that are now getting problems with them. But that was here. They've been here for ages. They've been here for a long time. But so I'm at these spots that I'm fishing, especially in the later of the campaign, a lot harder to access. Like more style of fishing for those that know what I do, and those that know how I fish will tell you I'm a caveman, man. I'm like, I'll happily sleep out -4 in just a bed chair, no bivvy, night under the stars. Nice clear skies, freezing cold. Like, I'll take the bare minimum, the absolute bare minimum I need, because it's the only way to fish this kind of place. I can't be setting up bivvies on the tracks, you know, unless I've got a base camp to go to, like where we're sitting now. And even then, all my shit got nicked from here, so that didn't pan out very well, did it? But yeah, I'll take the bare minimum. I'll sleep on bushes, mate. I've fished through storms on here, and there's 2 reasons why that's a stupid idea, really. The first reason being that I remember setting up the one night in a storm, thought, fuck it, took myself away, got my little tarp out, slept under there. I think I got set up at about 9 o'clock. It was hammering down, it really was hammering down. 11 o'clock, the right-hander is away. And I mean, it was flying, man. I thought I was into something decent, and I put my head torch on, and it turned out the water level had come up and it was lapping up my bag. I was probably 15 yards away from the water at the time when I set up, and all of a sudden I'm nearly in the lake. So yeah, I'm packing up all my shit, soaking wet through. I've got virtually a whole tree taking my rods out. It ain't fun, man. It ain't, like, I don't know why. I'm a sucker for punishment of it. Yeah, like, that's happened, and then again, you're setting up in storms. One night, mate, I set up, absolutely hammering down. Like, you have to use waders on here a lot. There's not many places that are worth fishing on here that you can access without waders. The best spots are always the hardest to reach on here at the moment, or the hardest to find at least. And I'd set up the one night, happy as Larry, rods on the mark. I knew there was fish in the zone. That's what annoyed me, man. I knew that there was fish in this area. I'd had a really good run of form the week before in the area, with a fair bit of pre-baiting and stuff like that. But I'd had a decent run of form at least. And I'd set up, and the rain was banging onto the shroud. Not an issue really for me. I don't mind getting a little bit damp, like. And at 2 in the morning, man, I'm waking up and I'm like, oh, I could do going for a piss, like, you know, bossed in there. And I rolled in my bed chair, and my whole body temperature, as soon as I rolled, just I was freezing. Like cold like my organs felt cold, it was that bad. Like, that's the only way to describe it, like I was, yeah. And I'd put my head torch on under my shroud, and a part of my shroud had moved, and I basically had my little 4-fold scope bed chair full of water. It was like a water bed that I took the top off. So that was time to pack down. The water level on this place was flying up at the time. So it's what, 2:30 in the morning, 3 o'clock nearly, and I'm cranking my rods in. They're all weeded up. They've got all the debris stuck through the braided main lines. My alarms have stopped working. There's that much water bashing through them. My bed's double the weight. All my tackle's double the weight. I've got to cart it for another 15 minutes at least to get back to my van. And I'm talking, that took me 2 trips at that time in the morning. Oh, I was exhausted for work that day. Felt rough afterwards as well. But like, nature of the game, I suppose, isn't it, on here? It's not, there's no comfort, man. You ain't getting wood chip pegs on here. Like, this is as comfy as it gets. Homemade table, little base camp set up here. We got beer crates to sit on, little fire pits and that. And this took a lot of work, man. There's a lot of effort to get all this here. So once it's here, you ain't moving really, are you? But this is the main base camp. This is the one that we had going probably 2 summers ago, I want to say. Is you have to cross the river to get to that. You ain't getting to it any other way with your tackle. You have to cross the river. You know what I mean? You're talking bed chairs on your head, all your kit up to your tits in river water, man. Flowing water as well. So like, I'm fortunate. I'm quite a weighty guy still. I'm not as fat as I used to be, but I can still hold my body weight up in that water and get to where I need to be. And I spent a lot of time in there as well. It's so hard to reach. It's one of those that you're going in there and it's more effort to actually get in there. Like, it's graft. Like, people don't want it. People don't want it these days, and that's one of the reasons I fish it, is I know that it's an area I can focus a lot of time and energy into and not suffer it, and not suffer someone jumping on my work. And like, these fish that I'm after are just, I don't know, like, they don't behave like normal fish. Like, you know, they move, mate. They move. You can put 100k of bait in if you want. They'll just move. There's that much naturals in here. You have to just be on them all the time. You have to find them all the time. Pre-baiting works really well. Like, really, really well. But you got to get that right as well. Like, once your spot's blown, it's blown. My bar markers that I use, they've been blown this year. I put a lot of energy into them bar markers this year, and they've produced minimal fish. Funnily enough, the night that blew was August the 8th. I remember that night. So, the night of my old man's birthday, knocking back. Went round for a family meal, Chinese, and didn't get here till late. You know, I'm full of rice, man. And I didn't really want to come, but I knew that if I stood a chance, it was that night. Like, the fish were in there. That was prime season, man. That was that August, September window, like before it started tapering off. So I wanted to maximise the effort and the time. Didn't get here till late. Waded my 4 rods out into the darkness, man. No head torch, because you get spotted by someone, man. You're in that spot was accessible, and I didn't really fancy the aggro. I wanted to just get in, fish, get out, get gone in the morning, go to graft. And Sunday night that was, and I waded out, got them rods out. Probably I got the rods out for about 11:30, I reckon. Like, at the time, the spot had been really slow on the producing, and I waded them rods out, got them out on the mark for 11:30. And that was this year, actually. Yeah, that was this year. And I got my head down, like I was feeling just lethargic as anything. You know, when you've ate too much, like, I didn't really fancy doing much else. And I lay there, lying in bed, and it was 1:30. Yeah, I think it was 1:30 in the morning. I'd got a take, and I felt the butt of my rod hit my bed chair, and I could hear my Tawny absolutely singing. It was singing, that Tawny. I could hear it over my alarm. And I'm like, yeah, this is going to be a smaller fish. Like, no big fish runs like that. And I had 30-pound end trap as a hook link at the time, size 4, big long shank hook. I was fishing, I believe there was artificial maize on that rod actually. Little bag of pellets just to see it down into the weed or whatever debris was out there, like just to give it a little patch. A little mouthful was what I aimed for. Like, I could put a big bed of bait out, but around my hook bait I needed just that mouthful of pellets. But this fish that I hooked anyway, I'd tighten that clutch up and lay down into it. And it instantly done 40 extra yards off the bat, man, on a tight clutch. And you're talking 3.5 test curve, 10-foot scopes, 50-pound braid I was on. And it was just singing through the reels of them rods, the eyes of them rods, like it was absolutely hammering my reel. And at that point I was like, whoa, what's going on here? Usually, most of the time, they'll have a short run and turn, but this fish would not give up, man. And got my weight, climbed into my waders, didn't take my head torch with me. Like, jumped into the water, went down the shallows, followed this fish. I got a fair bit of line back off it, and I thought, like, yeah, I'm going to get the better of this now. And I tried to turn it, like, lift it into this fish, and it was just a heavy weight, like real heavy weight this fish was. And again, that's just sort of, it kited, and then it went. And that fish I probably gained 20, 30 yards on it, and that fish went, man. Like, I'll never forget that run. And it's going and going. I got my rod up in the air, and then all of a sudden my rod's folded on me. I'm like, well, what's going on here? And like, I can make it out in the moonlight, man. I'm looking, and I'm looking at my reel, and there's no line on it. I'm on the knot on my braid that's holding it to the spool. So out there in front of me, I reckon I'm 30, 40 yards off the bank at this point. And out there in front of me, I know that there's over probably 180 to 200 yards of braid attached to this fish. And I'm like, what have I hooked here? Like, you know, like, I was adamant I'd hooked a cat. Like, I have never hooked anything like that. Now, I've never seen a cat in this place. I've sent a drone over it a few times, man. I fished big beds of pellet, massive beds of pellet, and I've never seen a cat on them. Like, my conclusion to that is that I probably hooked one of the carp in here. Some of them are real rowers, but I was handballing this fish back in. Like, literally, I was wrapping the braid around my line, pulling it down and cranking it back to my reel, cranking it back until I'd got a good quantity of it back to the point where I could play it normally. And this fish just wouldn't let out. Like, this fish did not let out. It kited off to the right of me, and I know that there's, out to my right, I knew there was a big bed of Canadian weed. There was a washed up tree, couple of oil drums, because I'd lost a fish on an oil drum years back out there, so I knew that was out there, and I'd seen them off the boat. You have to do a lot of boat work in places this sort of size, especially when they're river fed and you don't know what's getting washed up. So we done a lot of boat work back in the old marker, tons of boat work there, and then I went and bought myself a boat, little electric outboard and that I could get in and out of here with. And they are really handy. Like, I couldn't recommend it enough, man. It's good fun even if you don't use them. They're good fun to go out on. But I knew off my boat work that this fish was somewhere in between two trees that are washed up. It was on the good side of the trees. Like, it couldn't go through the middle of them. It'd gone around the back of them, so it was easy enough to sort of get out if I got the chance. But it had gone through a big bed of Canadian, and I knew that a lot of snags had washed up there. But the main snags to watch out for in that area was the oil drums that had washed up, rusty old sharp pieces of metal. But this fish belted off, banged through the Canadian, and funny enough, what give out was a 30-pound end trap. Like, I've never had it give out on me before, but that was what had snapped it. It either found a weak point or just pulled on it so hard that it had just give. And after that spot was blown. I put loads of bait back into that spot, loads of time back into that spot, and it never done another bite after that. That spot has never done a bite after that run. whether the whole shoal of fish that was with it have just spooked after that fish has spooked off that spot and they ain't visited again. I've had bites from all around that spot, talking 50, 60 yards past it, but they will not venture to that area no more. So I blacklisted the spot myself. I thought I'd put the time and effort in for another month, man, and it didn't do a single bite in a month, and I was still putting in that 15k a day. I was piling the bait into it, like, and all that was showing up was tufties, so that spot was blown, like, which is the nature of the sort of fishing anyway. These fish don't move from angling pressure. They only want to, they're in an area because I want to be there. And that was a mindset I had to take. It weren't like fishing a fishery where they get pushed around because you got someone spotting 15 spots an hour out there and the fish don't like the clattering of the spot and it's moved. And you ain't got some idiot banging his pegs in on the peg next to you, moving them to the other side. These fish move solely because I want to be where it's comfortable. And that is what, over the years, I sort of adapt my angling to. I knew where they was going to be at certain times of the year just because of the weather. I knew where they wanted to be at certain times of the year because of the naturals that were showing up, the mayflies. Well, when the mayflies show up, they're all out there. They're sitting in just off the area we call the bowl, because that's where the mayflies seem to settle and that's where they want to feed. You'll see them moving them off the top. And just after spawning, they're all out there behind you. Like, it's quite easy when I've been on here this long and I've divided this lake up into so many little areas to conquer them areas individually. I mean, each area is massive, like bigger than most lakes a lot of lads fish these days, but they're that's the best way of doing it, 100%. Like, we done a lot of campaigning on here, like, over the last few years. And unfortunately, when the COVID lockdown hit in, when angling weren't allowed, we didn't bother. We were just, it weren't worth the risk, man. We knew that our presence here weren't welcoming such, like, but I'm not going to say we shouldn't be here, but there was a certain group of people that don't like it, mate. I've been grassed up loads, and I know it's other anglers that are grassing me up. Don't know what the problem is. I think they're just a little bit like, maybe they want to do it and they just ain't got the gumption to get out and do it. You know what I mean? Like, you only get at the end of it, like, you got to do what makes you happy, and this makes me happy. I like being out here. I like being out in the wild. I like chasing shadows. I think that's Martin Bowler's book, Chasing Shadows, and it makes perfect sense because I ain't caught them yet. But I know that I reckon there's 3 in here I want. There's 3 fish in here that I've seen that I think if I can work them out, I reckon I'm 1 season away from catching them anyway. But I'd like to be left alone to do it. But yeah, so we had another spot going, and that was found off a boat. That was. I come out here one night on a boat, and I said one night, it was a day actually. I come out in the day on the boat. Nice hot day. All the weed beds was up, man. I was just wanting to set my boat out for a little run. I'd only tried it on a couple of the parks and stuff like that. And me and my mate jumped on this boat. Got out in the open water. No echo sound, no fish finder, no nothing. Just literally Polaroid glasses, both of us, outboard motor chugging away. I think it was late July time we was doing this. And like, we circled a lot of this lake and found nothing. And I come across an area that was static. It was out of the flow. It was, to be honest, it didn't really appeal to me that much at the time. But there was big, massive floating weed beds and sandy bottoms between them. And these weed beds looked like they was letting off gas, like bubbles. And as I got closer and closer to them, it was actually fish moving in the weed bed. And whether that was like unearthing the roots of the weed and it was causing fizzing to come up to the top, that's what it was. And we was observing these off the boat for a while. And I was looking for a new place to set up because the spots on the base camp's blown. Both base camps that we had going at the time, the spots were blown. It didn't matter how much bait we put in, it didn't matter how much time we put in. I don't think the fish just wanted to be there. They'd had enough of getting nailed, basically, and coming back and getting nailed and again and again and again. Like, the amount of repeats we've had. Like, I think the fastest growing fish I've caught in here that looks like a Simo, it was stacking on like £3 every few months, man, over the bait we was putting in. Like, we was filling in that much. These fish was just growing exponentially. Like, it was wicked. And like, I think the biggest we caught it at was 24. It ain't come out since. So whether it's been ottered or it's just clocked and it doesn't want to be over the bait, then it's realised it's getting nailed. They do wise up pretty quick to it. But yeah, I'd moved out to this area and had a look around in it, and it was real like jungle warfare kind of stuff, man. Your line lay was going to be atrocious. It didn't matter which way you looked at it. Like, there was that much weed in the area, you just couldn't get a clean line to anything. And the fish were sort of, they wanted to be in the weed. They was buried in the weed. But they had to get from weed bed to weed bed, because we noticed it, that you'd see a fish sort of flank and disappear. And then you'd move the boat around, and like 20 minutes later, you'd see the same fish. It was definitely the same fish. And I'll tell you what, it was the same fish. It was a two-tone common. It was clear as day what fish it was. Jet black back end and like a golden head. And it bolted from one weed bed and it went to another weed bed. And obviously, to do that, they have to come over the sandy areas. So we could go out in the boat and literally lower the rigs and place the rigs, not a problem, but we needed somewhere to fish from. And a lot of the fishing on here was like, it was like a conquest, man. You had to put the graft in just to make a peg, like in an area worth fishing. So we showed up with a boat. We drove, got the boat out to this area, and it was hard work, mate. We dropped off. We cleared a little area, like cleared all the undergrowth out, cut over these low hanging trees and that to get into this zone. And this zone was lovely. You could fit 2 sets of rods out in this zone, 2 bivvies in there, not a problem. We ended up squeezing 3 of us in there for the night. And we basically campaigned it, and it was like, that was the start of that third base camp even, should I say. That was the start of it. I'll never forget it. We went down on a Friday to check the spot. Saturday we landed to fish, and we got off Sunday afternoon. And we had an absolute mare getting off Sunday afternoon, because I think someone had grassed us up for being there. But it was that seemed to be the nature of it. We was greeted by the old Bill. They didn't really care, to be fair. I think they got better things to be chasing around, apart from a few lads that want to go fishing. But you know, that was the start of it. And we blanked that night. We couldn't understand what was going on, because we went out in a boat in the morning and the fish were still there, and I was still moving between the weed beds. But watching them, they'd move straight over the bait and wouldn't feed. Whether the bait was in an area they didn't really want to feed in, they just wanted to be there to bask in the sunshine, who knows. But we packed up defeated, loaded that boat to the hilt, talking 3 bed chairs strapped to the front, bivvies hanging off them, buckets hanging off them, like bags, everything, mate. That boat was overloaded beyond belief. 2 of us crammed into the back of it, trying to operate this outboard motor. And yeah, the outboard motor died basically, man. We had 1 oar come bobbing across the whole lake. And it was like, oh mate, it would have been the scene from a comedy sketch, mate. The old Bill was waiting for us when we got back, just standing there looking at us like, what the fuck are these idiots doing, man? Like, we showed up like fresh from the Channel crossing, mate. Beds, bivvies, the lot. It was terrible. And the old Bill just basically took an arm, slap on the wrist, and said, look lads, you're being a bit stupid there, but crack on and get gone. Their problem was, I think, was at the gate that night. We drove past, like, I mean, I've fished here for years, like, I really have. But that gate was wide open. Drove past it, clocked that gate was open. I thought, yeah, I'll just hide my van in there. Like, that gate's never open. I'm going to put my van in there. And I don't know who grassed us up. I reckon it was a dog walker. It turns out that where I'd actually parked the van was a feeder line to the railway. And that was the only reason the old Bill bothered showing up, I think, as well. Like, I don't think that there was a great deal of interest for us. I'm going to play it down if there is anyway. But, yeah, they showed up and, like, they just took our names and that and was like, look, stop being fucking stupid and get gone. So, went back home, had a Sunday dinner with the family, and forgot all about it. And then we reused that base camp, because we hadn't abused that one. We hadn't abused it like this one and the one over there. That hadn't been used. But we needed an access way into it that weren't going to involve having a boat out at stupid o'clock in the morning and doing silly shit on it. So basically we ended up like finding a way to cross the rivers, and even then that was a bit ropey at the best of times, you know what I mean? But we could get to there, and we'd cut a nice little track out, we'd made the pegs, and we campaigned it from there. Little fire pit to cook all our food on, man. Like the food I cook up all here, bang on. And we did well out of there for a few sessions, and then I want to say completely died a death again. Like, it was chasing these fish around this pit's been ridiculous. Like, I mean, I fully enjoy it and everything, but it does get hard work. Like, it's exhausting, mate. You're talking, I'm crossing areas of the lake, I'm crossing areas of rivers. I don't bring a barrow with me, man, so I'm walking with my rods, my rucksack, my bait boat, my bait. I got my bed chair on my head, like waders all the time. It's exhausting to get around. It's an adventure and a half, really, to be fair with you. But we're approaching nearly a decade on here, man, and it's become an absolute obsession. Like, this big pit carping is me through and through, and I'm gonna put a bet that I'm a season away from having the ones I want. My angling aspect now is here. That is it. Like, it's become such an obsession. Like, and it's not a casual, oh, I'll just flit in, I'll just flit out, man. I'm that driven now. I know what's in there. I want to catch that fish now. It's about the chase for it, man, and the characters that I'm catching along the way. I've had some really, really mental looking fish over the years. I got photos with a two-tone leather. It's brilliant looking fish, jet black on the tail end, not a scale on it, a little sunburnt head on it. It was wicked. That brings us to where we're at now. 10 years of just pure, man, unparalleled graft. Like, talk hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of kilos of bait. Like, man hours beyond belief. Boat work, lugging kit around left, right and centre, crossing rivers, getting stranded in floods. It's just, yeah, it's what I live for, man. It's good fun.